So, Robert, first of all, thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
To joining us. We have, what we've aimed to do is at least have, we have a number of people who are on various different time zones. So what we've at least tried to do is ensure that there's at least one member of each team represented here. We are recording this, if that's all good with you, so then we can share this later on as well with the other teams at the different time zones. But as I said, first of all, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us, and also with your colleague. And over to you, I suppose. Do you want to go through a little bit about yourself and Vultus?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for the invite. Pleasure to have this opportunity. So today I'll go through a little bit about sort of Vultus and kind of what we do, and then I will go through a bit about kind of, so we've been working in the sector for about 4.5 years, so a bit kind of what are the challenges we see, what are some of the trends, and then there will be, I think, opportunities also for Q&A. I think we'll be happy to answer any questions, and we'll be available on Slack also in case you have any further questions. So I'll just share my screen just because I think that might be a bit easier. So Vultus, our kind of core aim or mission is to eliminate waste in farming. And just in short about what we do, so we provide precise satellite recommendations that work with existing machinery and help farmers to achieve quite significant input savings, especially on nitrogen, but we're also developing services for other inputs. And the core thing is that we can produce then more food using less chemicals, which is something quite good. And we are at this stage active in quite a large area, so we've been growing quite a bit. And I think also from that perspective of, I think many of the projects here are quite early stage, but we've kind of been through that entire process of also trying to grow things and how to enter markets and things like that. So I think we have some experience with that, and hopefully can help. And so what we do more in detail and kind of some of our services. So we've basically built a pipeline around measuring different things about the farm. So we have different measurements about things like the moisture in the plant and the soil, nitrogen uptake in the plant, also things like soil organic carbon, and all these things go into, we're building different models based on those measurements that produce recommendations that can then be implemented directly into the equipment. So we also have components to actually transcribe all our recommendations into files that work with most of the major tractor brands. And all of these things are kind of, so we have a lot of different supporting indicators. I mentioned some of them, and here's kind of more of an overview, but we have a lot of things linked to vegetational indices, things like nitrogen uptake, above ground biomass, also things like soil organic carbon, and some of these things I mentioned here are still, they're not in the production version that you might have access to soon, but most of this is available, and you will be able to get access to it directly through an API. So everything that we do is basically available through an API. And so everyone who's part of this hackathon, if you Slack me or Chaitanya, we'll give you a token, and then you can basically use all these services and you can integrate them into your products. And so if you go to docs.spatial.farm or spec.spatial.farm, so the docs, you can see all the documentation, and spec, you can see the API spec. But I think that the main thing is that kind of we want to sort of help different applications to use these types of technologies. Our idea is not to just kind of be this walled garden that just offers things for its farmers, but we want to kind of be an infrastructure that other people can use to provide useful services. So we see a lot of this kind of satellite infrastructure that we have built being really helpful to many other applications, to many other companies. And that's where we're really focusing on building a good infrastructure. So we can, for example, support you in building very user-friendly applications. It's a lot faster. Instead of having to build all this yourself, you can just integrate it into your models, your workflows, and can be some of these measurements can be very complementary to some measurements you might already have. So maybe you're working with drones or soil samples or other sensors. And this can kind of complement that in terms of enabling you to have more scalability and also to see variations in the field and things like that. So if you want a token, please Slack me or Chaitanya, who will also be a judge tomorrow. So that kind of covers the first part about a little bit what we do and who we are. The next part we'll go through a bit more kind of the industry and some of the challenges we see. I think in general there's many challenges, but I'll go through a bit about the industry background, some characteristics that we think are quite interesting, some of the challenges we see, and also some of the opportunities that I think could be worth working on. So if you look at kind of agriculture as a whole, it is a very kind of large industry, and it is quite sort of an old industry. I mean, it's been around for a long time. It's old in many ways, not just because it's quite foundational to sort of human society, but also the people in the industry are, in general, the demographics are quite old. So the farm operators, the age is just increasing, and so the average age is around sort of around 60 at this point. And this presents a challenge because you have to keep that sort of user group in mind when you're building applications. And it's also partially for that reason, it's one of the least digitized sectors currently. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to digitize agriculture. It's one of the sort of last sectors to be sort of eaten by software. And we've seen sort of software taking over many other sectors. And I think there's a big opportunity here to do the same for agriculture. And I think there's plenty of opportunity to build things around that. And the last characteristics I'll go through in terms of the industry background is that farming, so you have this elderly demographic that has been working with farming for their entire life, and all through their life they've been working primarily with sort of managing risk. So there's risk sort of presents itself for farmers in many different ways. So firstly, you have to consider that you have massive upfront costs to actually get production. So you need to have farmland, you need to have equipment, you need to invest in massive amounts of fertilizer, pesticides, everything. So you have this upfront cost that would pay off if you get a good yield. But while you're producing the crop, you have massive production risks. You have things like pests, you have weather problems, you have a bunch of different things. So you're really not guaranteed that you'll get something in the end for all these investments. And lastly, even if you do get a good yield, you actually don't know that you can sell that yield at a profit, because you're dependent on commodity markets that are fluctuating extremely much depending on what your neighbors are growing and how much their yields are. So farming is really a lot about managing risk. So, and I think that kind of, when you look at the challenges, I think a lot of the challenges is that you need to help the farmers to manage this risk. And if you don't, then, if they see digitalization just as another risk, then I think it's going to be a lot of resistance to use it. And that's kind of what we're seeing today. So what are then some of the other challenges and some of the opportunities that we can work on? So I think one thing is that chemical inputs are quite overused. We see a lot of opportunities here to work with chemical inputs and make them more effective. We see almost all the chemical inputs, you basically spread them evenly across the field, and you sort of guess how much you're going to use. And this applies to all the fertilizers, the pesticides, seeding, everything like that. And I think here there's a big opportunity to use digital data, to actually improve this and to make the farming more precise and more effective. And I think some of the challenges are covering specifically on this. I think this is a really big challenge that I think there deserves a lot of work on. Another thing is sort of tied to this is there is kind of a really big lack of operational data and sort of lack of data about what's happening in the field. So most of the data that the farmer actually utilizes is actually not digital. So most of the farmers, they will go into their fields, they have a feeling for what's happening on their farm. They will touch the soils, they will look at their plants, everything like that. There's a lot of sort of manual data collection that is not digital. And I think this leads to actually more production risk, because you can't actually track things sort of season over season. And there's a lot of opportunity to supplement that sort of analog data that they have about their farms with digital data. I think that can be really helpful for many farmers. And I think is a big challenge to overcome, that you don't have this data today and they're not used to working with that type of data. I mean, there's obvious emissions challenges. I think agriculture is, it's a big part of global emissions. And there's a huge challenge here in how can we actually improve production? So ensure that we have to improve production by about 70% in the sort of coming 30 years, but at the same time reduce the emissions. So in the past, the way we've actually achieved production increases has been primarily through increases of emissions. So for example, we just applied more inputs. So if you apply more inputs, well, then you will in general receive a bit higher yield. Or we've, for example, increased the amount of land that we've used to agriculture. So we've, for example, just removed a lot of forests and replaced it with farmland. And that's something that, moving forward, if we want to actually reduce emissions, these are things we cannot do. So the tools that we can use to increase production are not the same as we had in the past. And this really presents a really huge challenge, because, well, how are we going to do this if we can't increase the amount of land and you can't just apply a bunch more inputs? tied to another challenge is kind of the infrastructure in agriculture. There's a lot of sort of lacks of standards. I mean, I think this is something in many sectors, but I think especially in agriculture, since it is so new to digitalization, there's really a lack of sort of standards about how to do different things. There's a lot of compatibility issues and a general kind of lack of experience with technology in most kind of companies in the industry. So we see many even large companies that are, they're buying all these sort of startups and want to, get into the area of technology, but they're really struggling with it, and it's something which I think it's kind of a little bit of a cultural challenge where farmers and farming industry is not like the most experienced with this type of technology, and I think that kind of shines through in some of the things that are happening in the industry, which is sort of dominating the minds of many farmers in terms of digitalization. And I think there's a really big opportunity here for startups that are good at technology to come here and improve the infrastructure and to make it really good, and lending that from other sectors that have done so in the past. And I think kind of an example of this is, like, if you look at the infrastructure, look at something like data ownership. So who owns, for example, vehicle data? Well, in some cases, the vehicle operator actually, like the vehicle manufacturer, owns the data. So when a farmer, for example, has yield data of their farm, which is super helpful for them to understand where your field is performing good or bad and identifying issues. Well, many times they don't actually own their data, so they can't actually use the data. They're not permitted to use their data. And that presents a huge challenge for the farmer if they've bought that equipment and then now they can't access that data. And then even if they could access that data, they might actually not be able to transfer the data and use it in their different tools, because the different tools have different standards. And then even if they could do that, they don't actually know how to utilize the data. So I think it's kind of like you have this myriad of problems that need to be solved. And I think there's things to do on all these different issues, which can provide huge value towards farmers. So, well, I think in general, kind of big challenges are big opportunities, and there's sort of a really big commercial market here, and there's a lot of underserved communities in terms of digitalization. So I think there being so many problems is just, it's, if you're building a company in this space, I think that's great, because it really means that there's a lot of things you can do that can be really helpful and actually make a difference, and it can create a big market for yourself. So one thing that we see as a key challenge is kind of the infrastructure part, and I think that there should be more actors who are working on the infrastructure. I think, like, if you take like mobile phones, every mobile manufacturer doesn't have their own infrastructure for, like, there's like iOS and then there's Android. I think there should be something like that for agriculture. There needs to be some sort of standardization of how different platforms work, how different types of data work, data ownership, and all these types of things. And there are efforts here that are pushing this forward, and I think it's not that nothing is happening here, but there's still a huge opportunity here to define that standard and become that standard. And so I think kind of who is going to be the next sort of Android for farming, it might be one of these projects here. We don't know. There's clearly no Android for farming yet, and I think there's a big opportunity to make one of those. So I hope someone does that. I mean, I already touched upon this, but sort of solving the input crisis. I mean, it is really a crisis that we're wasting the vast majority of chemical inputs. There's, it's a huge crisis for the environment. It's a huge crisis for farmers. And I think there's just a huge amount of opportunities here to build tools that, I mean, it's not just like how much you should apply, but also when you should apply it, where you should apply it, what you should apply. All these different challenges, I think you can build tools with data around. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here to solve the input crisis. In terms of the climate crisis, I mean, I think this is kind of an obvious challenge to solve, but it's really difficult. I mean, I think we need to have cost-effective ways of reducing emissions in farming, so we have the same amount of production but less emissions. I think that is key, and all the tools need to be both cost-efficient and do those things, which is not easy. I think one such thing, and I think one of the challenges here, I'm really happy that it focuses on that, is sort of how can we make the soils store more carbon? If we make the soils more healthy and they bind more carbon to them, then we could potentially even reverse climate change with farming, and farming could be a carbon sink instead of a carbon emitter. And I think it is a really interesting, there's a lot of challenges with that, of course, but it is a really interesting concept, which I think deserves a lot of thought about how we can do that and how we can support that. And there's going to be a lot of things that need to go into that, but we need to have a lot of measurements. We need to have a lot of, we need to test a lot of ways of managing farms. There's just a huge, amount of opportunities here, because I think that could potentially be a really massive, challenge to solve and a massive market to work in. And I think lastly, kind of all these things go come into the point about we need to sort of empower the farmer. So we need to empower them with different types of technologies to solve their key problems. And I think many of these things are kind of societal problems, but we have to kind of solve them by solving the farmer problems. We need to help them, for example, manage their risk with data better. We need to help them become more sort of profitable and effective with, for example, more effective use of inputs. And we need to enable them to use data in ways that are easy for them to use. Because I think ultimately, like we are, the lack of standards is making it really difficult for the farmer to run their farm using data, and it's making their life, really, really challenging. So I think if you can make it easier, then you really empower them to use these tools, use the technology that we have available, and to make a difference and to solve the economic, so to make farming a lot more sustainable. So with that, I'll kind of leave it over for Q&A, and if you have any questions, then feel free to.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Rob. There's actually quite a few things. I'll open it up to the other people or the participants as well to sort of send through messages or any questions. But I actually have quite a few myself.
Yeah.
So if the guys don't mind me kind of jumping in, there's a couple of things. When I first if I go in order of the slides that you mentioned, one was about the growth, about the exponential growth that you as an organization has experienced over the years. What do you think's changed with that? What do you more, is it become more accepted to use technology and to sort of take it to another level? What's made your organization grow so exponentially?
I would say it's kind of like there's a pretty big kind of demand for digital services in agriculture, but I think it's just like there isn't that much choice. Like, technically there is a lot of choice for farmers. There's a lot of companies working in the space, but there's really, I think, a lack of tools that are really, really helpful for the farmer, that are easy for them to use and kind of empower them. And I think there's, I think, we've been working in this space for now 4.5 years, and it took a while to get to a point where we actually got any traction or got anything to work. I think part of that is also, the business model we have. I think it's we're working with the ecosystem. We're trying to empower it, and I think that has also been helpful. But yeah, I think if there's a big demand for farmers to use these types of tools. I think, as you mentioned, also it is becoming a lot more normal and accepted to use digital tools in farming. I think at this point, like almost no farmer isn't aware of these things. It's more of a choice of, do you want to use it? Do you have tools that are useful? And I think in a lot of cases you're seeing that the answer is more and more becoming yes. You're seeing your neighbor get good results with, you're testing it, you're seeing it works, and that's kind of how the adoption slowly grows. But yeah, so I think it's a combination of these things. But definitely, I think there's a lot of growth ahead, and I think it's for a combination of those factors.
Brilliant. And again, it mentioned that you had the industry's 2.4 trillion, which is, considering the value of the industry sector, and with that lack of choice, I think, to me, that's mind-blowing. That's absolutely mind-blowing. And you did mention, which actually follows on from Rob earlier, which he actually referred to quite a bit from the fintech industry, and looked at, we can, and this is how I think industries really grow anyway, is actually learning from other industry sectors and how we can modify that, how we can implement that into specific one, and in this case, the agriculture side. Is there sort of a trend or another industry that you think that we could be looking at to really help take things forward?
I don't have a very good example. I think like fintech is one good example. I think there is a I don't have a really good example, because I think farming is kind of unique. Like there are so many attributes and like structures in farming, how decentralized it is, how tied it is to geopolitics, like demographics, all these types of things. So I think there's definitely a lot of differences. But so I don't have a good example of just something you can just copy paste. But I think in general we can learn from how different sectors have evolved. I think fintech, just any type of information technology sectors, You know, okay, let's take something like using, you know, digital accounting systems and CRMs, things like that.
Yeah.
I don't think the challenge here is that different from like CRMs. Like ultimately, for management system is to some extent sort of a CRM for, you know, for farming. It has many of the similar components, and I think kind of the lessons that we had there, I think the trend we had there, I think similar things will apply to agriculture. So definitely, I think there are parallels we can draw, but I don't have a good one where I can just say
well,
these are good.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from on that, because we've got the marine tech one coming up, and even speaking with the clients on that.
Yeah.
It's surprising how many people are actually still using Excel when we go through digitalization and everything else. It's quite surprising on there. We have a question which says, have you experienced any problems from a farmer side for adopting the technologies in the farm?
Yeah, I mean, many problems. I think there's no shortage of problems, let's say. I think so some of the problems, I think, is kind of making the tools intuitive and fitting into kind of the workflows that many growers have. So I'd say they're kind of making sure that because I think if you're not used to using these types of kind of web applications, especially around maps and satellite data and things like that, if you're not used to that, then even if our developers might think it's very intuitive how things are structured, the farmer, for example, just drawing a polygon or drawing their field boundaries on the map, we've seen that just how you're putting all those different components, things like that, it can be very challenging. So for us, it might be easy, but for many growers, it is actually very, very challenging, and making it very intuitive and easy and guiding them through that process. Things like that are really helpful. And then I think the second part I would say is implementing things into the equipment. I think there's still challenges to be solved there in terms of making it easy to take recommendations and apply them in your equipment. There's a lot of different things there with different standards. There's a lot of different errors that happen every now and then. So, you know, we've definitely seen a lot of challenges, but I would say intuitiveness and integration with equipment, those are probably the two biggest ones that we're working with the most.
Yeah. And another question that's come through, it says, is there any resistance from farmers to moving away from traditional methods, as they might find it too techy, too complex, too overwhelming?
I would say there it's kind of I would kind of reverse it and say, like, if you make it too techy, too complex, and too overwhelming, well, then it's not going to fit the target market. So, you know, it's a target market that doesn't want to just have something. It doesn't want technology for the sake of technology, and it is very used to have it, like it has established traditional well-working methods that it doesn't want to disrupt. I think we should see technology as kind of augmenting and supporting those methods instead of trying to like completely disrupt them or replace them. I think if you say that if you make the technology not very techy, not very complex, not overwhelming, and that it fits very nicely into how they already do things and how they already might perceive their farm, then I think you will have a much easier time to have adoption than if you have the opposite. So I think it's you really have to adapt it well to the market, and I think that's kind of, as kind of technologists, it's our job for us to do that. It's not like we shouldn't just complain that, oh, the farmer doesn't like our application. It's we didn't make an application the farmer liked.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's another question. As the disruptive segment of the AgriTech sector grows, do you think there will be a risk of companies with large data sets monopolizing the agricultural data analysis market, like Google, Facebook, and their respective sectors?
I would say both yes and no. So in a way, farming is kind of I'm not aware of any monopolies in farming, and I don't think that's because there has been that much regulation of farming. It's just that farming is extremely kind of fragmented and decentralized, where you have things are very different in different parts of the world. And I think when you talk about kind of big data, AI, things like that, then I think it's a question of how comparable is a model you build in, let's say, Sweden to a model you would build in, let's say, South America. It's not necessarily that comparable. And I think, sure, if you have one company that is successful globally and can collect really nuanced data all across the world, then sure, I think you could have that challenge. But I think it is very challenging to be successful all across the world in agriculture because it is so fragmented. And I think the needs and the challenges are so different across the different geographies in the world. So sure, I'm not saying that there isn't such a risk, but I would say that the risk is significantly less than in other sectors because I mean, we haven't seen any type of like centralization like that before happening. Like even if things like inputs and the chemicals, even there, it might be relatively consolidated, but it's still, we have many different large actors, and I think we'll continue seeing that probably on the data side as well. It might change in the future, but I think for the foreseeable, like maybe like 10 years or 20 years, I would be very surprised to see it being a similar type of monopoly as you see with like social media or search or things like that.
Yeah, we actually had a question from another participant asking, and you kind of touched upon this, that each part of the world really has a different sort of setup and different challenges. One was used just now as an example in India, about how can you overcome the barriers of, one, financial implementation costs, and secondly, those who may just not be familiar with the tech in itself.
Yeah,
is that sort of cause a problem? So I know that you guys have actually got a division in India as well, so hopefully that you'll be able to answer on that side too.
Yeah, sure. I think that kind of it goes on that point of like it is the sort of circumstances are very different, and the challenges you have are very different. So the technology itself needs to be extremely different. Like the ability to have a tool that, like, let's say in Sweden, you could sell something where you have a fixed cost. That's like, let's say it's maybe £100, something like that. Like that would be fine. But if you would, have that solution in India, like I think most smallholder farmers would not want to pay £100 for a piece of technology. Like I just don't see that happening. So I think you really have to adapt things, and I think that kind of goes to the point of it needs to. I think there will be a lot of local solutions, and I think
absolutely
if you are a technology provider, you have to really work with the local market to adapt things so that it makes sense. One like interesting example we had is so our recommendations, we made it so that we have super simplified like zones that you can print on paper, and where if you're spreading things manually, if you don't have any fertilizer equipment, you can still kind of adjust the rate in different parts of your field. And that's something that like we, for example, demonstrated in India and Pakistan. I think that's kind of an interesting, change where normally you would say, okay, you would integrate it into the equipment, but here you don't have equipment. So what do you do? So you have to sort of work with what they have, and it's not ideal, but at least it works, and at least it kind of enables them to have this type of technology at the very low cost.
Perfect, good. And there's a specific question: are you using satellite imagery to get nitrogen content of the soil? Is that specifically what you're looking at as one part of your solution?
Indirectly, yes. So we measure the soil organic carbon in the topsoil, and the soil organic carbon sort of corresponds to the availability of nitrogen in the soil. There is kind of relationships between that. It's not like a perfect relationship, but it where you have more soil organic carbon in general, you also have more availability of nitrogen from the soil. So that is something we include in our models. Yes. So the short answer is yes, but it's not quite like satellite to nitrogen.
Okay. And finally, what trends are you seeing, if any, in terms of preferences, needs across different regions and countries across the globe? And I'm actually going to modify that a little bit and kind of break that into regions, if I may. Bearing in mind that the hackathon that we've set is specifically, well, it started out specifically for the UK market. Can I direct that before different parts of the globe to the UK?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say there's still a big challenge of kind of, I think the whole point of like proving that the food production you have is more sustainable. I think there's kind of there's a lot of need for that, and I think it comes both for from the farmer side. I think it would be really nice for them to have that, but I think also it kind of goes further up in the supply chain, where as a consumer, you want to buy products that are kind of good for the environment, and you want to be able to support that, but you can't really. You only have the option of eco or traditional, and I think kind of making something that you can demonstrate is kind of good for the environment, good for the world, and uses all the modern tools. I think something like that, I think there's a huge trend towards trying to build the components for that. And I think that requires that you understand kind of what is sustainable, like how how do you measure and prove that the production is sustainable, and having tools that can enable the farmer to be more sustainable. I think that is something which is very interesting, and I think that will then trickle out into more sort of certifications, things like that, that are not eco, but that are kind of similar to that use kind of modern tools and that prove that you have sustainable production. I think I would say that that is something which is, especially here in like Europe, is very key, and I think there's a big trend towards that.
Is that different out of different regions? Do you see that different trends are coming through from different regions within the globe, like sort of different continents have different trends?
Yeah, I would say kind of in Europe, environmental sort of sustainability is I think slightly more prioritized than in other regions. I think you have other regions where, for example, food security, like increasing food production, reducing the import of fertilizers, these types of things can be higher priorities in many other regions. But I would say I would say definitely there are different priorities. I would say sustainability is something which most, like, I wouldn't say that there's any region that doesn't care about it. It's just that I think here in Europe, it's like maybe like #1 priority, whilst maybe in another country it might be reducing their fertilizer import, because for many other social economical reasons that might be more important for them. So I think here in Europe we care very much about sustainability. And it shines through.
Yeah, even from the UK government and and the European Parliament, etc., for the amount of what they're pledging, what they're the funds in which they're allocating to this. I totally agree with you. There are still some questions coming through, but what I would suggest is maybe if they can message you directly on Slack, and then we can kind of go through that. Everyone, Rob and Krishna are on Slack. They're here as mentors. They're here to help you out. If you would like to log in, use their data sets, look at their case studies, look at their documents, then they'll give you the passcodes, etc. for that. Utilize them as much as possible, because these guys are experts in their field. So it's thank you very much, Robert, and I'm sure I'll speak to you later on, and certainly over Slack as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.